Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to the workshop. Appreciate you coming by and checking it out. Hopefully, in the next hour and a half or so, we can talk about board game organization and answer some questions and just talk a little bit about different things you can do to kind of make your games get to the table a little faster, clean up a little faster, and make them a little more fun to play while you're using them. I think nowadays everybody's pretty familiar with the concept of doing something to improve the organization of your board game. I know we started doing this ourselves, both personally and professionally, about 7 years ago. And back then, a lot of people were making things with foam core and doing a lot of homegrown solutions. Now, with laser cutting and 3D printing, there's all kinds of new, cool, and advanced things that you can do to really improve the quality of your board game. So I want to talk a little bit about those different methodologies today, talk about some design tools, show you a little bit behind the scenes about what we do at the Broken Token to design some organizers, put some stuff together, and just kind of go over lots of different methods for organizing your game. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Hopefully you can see my in-home workspace here. And I wanted to I'm sure most people are pretty familiar with the concept of foam core since that's been going on for a long time. But basically, that's kind of like your entry level, means to take a board game and figure out a way, to do some organization. So that's pretty basic. Most of your foam core you can buy, at local hobby stores. Typically, will run you around $5 or $6 for a sheet of foam core, and the process is really pretty simple. Whether you're doing organization for 3D printing or laser cutting or foam core, it kind of all starts the same. You have to think about, like, what can I build for my game that's going to help me make the game more fun. It's going to make it easier to get it to the table. So some of the things that we typically think about are what components in the game do you use throughout gameplay, and what components might you only use during setup, and then return the rest back to the box. And you kind of want to segment those logically so that you can bring the components out that you use throughout the game and have them accessible while you play, while leaving everything else off the table and keeping it pretty clean. So really the design process starts with, obviously, getting to know the game really well. If you've played the game a few times, you probably already have an idea about how you want to set things up or what you can do to make things a little more organized. So when you kind of have those concepts, then we can kind of jump right into like how we might design some of these things. So I'm actually using lanterns right now as sort of an example. This is a game that we love, and we're working on a wooden insert for lanterns that should be out fairly soon, but we'll kind of use this as an example of things that we can make that will make setup and gameplay a little bit easier. So, and by the way, also just wanted to say, if you guys have any questions about anything, just throw it up in chat. I'm keeping an eye on chat, and we'll answer these questions as they come up. So feel free to get them in there anytime. And if I miss something, I will try to get to it. So, right, so how do we decide what games we might do an insert for? So at the Broken Token, we kind of, when we first started and inserts weren't really well known, a lot of the games that we chose were just our personal favorites, ones that were evergreen, games like Seven Wonders and Lords of Waterdeep, King of Tokyo, those popular games that really everybody knew. Nowadays, with inserts being so common and us having a pretty big customer base, the majority of our decisions are coming from customer recommendations, actually. So if you guys have any recommendations for things you want to see, then please do reach out to us, because that's sort of the most important method for us to decide what we want to do next. Obviously, we like to partner with publishers too and work on things for up and coming games, but that with what customers want to see are really what we try to hit. So awesome, thanks for that question. So yeah, I don't want to spend a lot of time really on foam core stuff. I think most people kind of know how you would go about doing something like that. It is really accessible. You don't need a 3D printer. You don't need a laser cutter. The only special tools you really need are a hobby knife and a ruler and pen. So everybody's pretty much got everything they need to do some basic board game organization if you want to make something out of foam core. So get you a sheet of foam core. Make sure you have something like a cutting mat is super handy. You don't want to, tear up your desk. So one of these self-healing cutting mats is really nice for this sort of thing. And so it really kind of starts with, focusing on what components you want to organize first. So let's say we wanted to make a tray for the tiles, for lanterns. Then you're going to start by kind of taking measurements of the components and planning what size box you want to build for this. So I like using millimeters because working in fractions of inches is just not very intuitive when you're talking about 7/30 seconds and things like that. Like nobody can remember that. So it's also, believe it or not, I think most of game publishers are probably using millimeters when designing their components as well. So when you look at something like this tile, it looks like it's exactly 60 millimeters, 60 by 60. So that makes it easy to work with something like that. It might be 59. It might be a little bit less than that. So yeah, so you'd kind of start with looking at the components and just thinking about how you wanted to access these components. For something like the tiles, another thing to keep in mind if you're actually going to build something to go in the original box, which is really kind of the purpose here, you might be building something like a stand to hold these and you don't care if it fits in the box or not. Maybe you want to build a cool tray that you use when it's out on the table and your requirement is not that it fit in the box. But if that is one of your requirements and you want to make sure it fits, then you need to understand the box dimensions first. So with something like lanterns, obviously the box here is a little narrow, and we would take a look at the depth of the box and using this tool right here is a micrometer. And you can pick these up on Amazon fairly inexpensively. I think 20 bucks or something like that. And you just slide the edge of the tool here, and it changes the measurement as you do that. You can also use the back end of the micrometer here to measure depth. So for the box, I would do something like bring this out a ways, stick it down the edge of the box, and then take a measurement. And it says like 49.72. So I'd probably call this, believe it or not, I'd probably go down a little bit and call this like 49 or 48, because you typically want to leave room in the box for something like the instruction manual to sit on top. So you don't really want to, round up to 50. So we call it something like 49 millimeters or 48 millimeters to leave a little gap at the top. So if your idea was to build something to hold these and keep them in the box, then you wouldn't want to go much deeper than that. And looking at the number of tiles just in the base game, I don't have the expansion, but I think I might have a couple promo cards in here. You would want to make something that held like multiple stacks of cards. So like splitting the cards that I have in half are about 35 millimeters. So I'd measure out for boxes like that. So with foam core, it's pretty basic. You're just going to I would use something like a metal ruler so that you're not going to be like cutting into a wood ruler, and then a really sharp X-Acto knife, and then just like lightly scoring across the foam core. I like to do it in 2 passes. I like to if you're pushing really hard, sometimes you can make a squiggly line. So if you do a really light pass to just score it, and then go back and then do a deeper pass, it normally follows it pretty easily, and then you get a pretty nice sharp cut that way. So cutting the stuff is fairly simple. Just do it like that. And then for gluing, there's a few different options you could use. A lot of times just white glue works well. I've seen people use hot glue and other things like that, or various forms of Gorilla Glue. So there are a lot of different options. I would just probably use white glue. And I created a little box here. This was one that I just cut and then glued together earlier, so you can kind of see. I left one side open, obviously, to get the tiles in, and then I just did like a quick little hand cut to give me gaps to access with my fingers. So this is not a box size that would fit into the lanterns box, but it's just a sample to show kind of how you would put something together. And you want to think about things like, how are you going to access the tiles once they're in the box? So that's why something like finger cutouts or access holes on the bottom are things that you would probably want to consider. So I see a question that came up earlier. How do you deal with the fact that many gamers sleeve their cards and components? It's a really good question. We basically make the assumption that everybody's going to sleeve their stuff. We never want to design something that doesn't support sleeved cards. It's best to design it to support sleeved cards, and if you don't sleeve them, then you'll just have extra space in there. So we always kind of go for the worst possible situation in terms of how much space we need to dedicate to something. So for cards, we would dedicate enough space for all the cards sleeved, and then we know everybody at least will be happy with that solution. Nobody will complain if there's extra space, but if you sleeve your cards and they don't fit, that'll cause a problem. So good question, thanks. Next question was, how do you keep your foam core from drying out, going stale? That's a good question. Honestly, I don't use foam core a whole lot, and even if I did, here in Southern California, we have a pretty dry climate, so it's not something I would experience around here. I would say that if you're in a really humid climate and you're going to have problems with foam core going bad, there's probably not much you can do about it. Because honestly, even if you're keeping your raw material clean, once you build something and put it in a box and it's on your gaming shelf, there's really not a lot you can do if you're in a super humid environment. I haven't personally run into a problem with that though, so I don't know if that's a problem to be concerned about. We know there are some guys in the industry that create foam core solutions that they sell, and I haven't heard of any issues with them in terms of longevity, but that's something I would have to find out about myself. But I don't have any particular tips that would work other than like those packs of desiccant, but I don't know if that's a good long-term solution or not. Let's see, there was another comment about Power Rangers Kickstarter came with the option of card storage box, but would love to see how to store the minis from all the expansions in the Kickstarter box possible. That's a good question, and definitely the Power Rangers Kickstarter is something we want to take a look at for sure. Let's see, CP Wilson says, my wife made a foam core insert for our Terraforming Mars. Our friend has a 3D printer. That's awesome. I'd love to see it. I always like to see what everybody's making out there. And let's see, if your foam core has problems, your cardboard game will likely have the same problems. That's true. Yeah, that's true. So if you're in a superhuman environment, you might just have issues all around. So that's kind of it. That's all I want to jump into in terms of foam core. I think you can kind of see what the possibilities would be there. It's a very low barrier to entry, doesn't take a lot of tools, doesn't cost a lot of money. It probably takes the most in terms of time because just cutting everything out and gluing it is pretty finicky. You need to find ways to clamp the stuff together while the glue is drying, and there's different ways that you can clamp. I actually grabbed a few clamps from my garage and used this to just, you don't want to over clamp it because you can really break the foam core, but I had to keep a little bit of pressure on the sides while the glue was drying. So it's a bit time consuming, but if you want to DIY it and do it yourself, then it's definitely something that you can jump into right away. Probably, I don't know if anybody has any other questions about foam core, let me know and I'll answer as much as I can. Rubber bands are good. Yeah, definitely rubber bands could be great for clamping things together if you have varying sizes of that. And painter's tape. Yeah, that's another good tip. So yeah, if you have any other questions about foam core, I'll try and help out with that. But I kind of also wanted to jump in next to, I think, what's becoming the next most accessible thing for everybody. I think everybody's now is familiar with 3D printing. If you don't already have a 3D printer, you've at least heard of it. It doesn't seem like it was 7, 8, 9 years ago where you first started seeing videos of a 3D printer doing something. I think we were all pretty amazed that that technology existed. Now, in not too much of the future, the prices of 3D printers have come down so much that, they're very, very affordable. Brings me to another thing I kind of wanted to share with you guys real quick before we jump into that. I created a list here of design tools that we use and might be interesting to you, and I put them on our website just so it's something you could access even later. So if you go to thebrokentoken.com/tools, you'll access this page. And the reason I want to bring this up now is because I also listed some recommended 3D printing hardware based on our own experiences with it. So yeah, just to kind of return to what I was saying, like 3D printing now is so accessible that the hardware is fairly inexpensive. It's not too difficult to use. So really getting to where you can design and make something and 3D print it is really getting easier and easier. So it's a pretty good solution for DIY, and I think a lot of people jump into it and really quickly see the joy of being able to envision something on a screen and turn that into a physical object. I mean, for me, it's one of the coolest things you can possibly do. I don't know if that scratches everybody else, it's the same as it does for me. But that's the concept of having an idea and designing it and then creating it is really super cool. And that's one of the things that got me into wanting to do insert design early on with laser cutters, is just that kind of what we call micro manufacturing, where it doesn't take an entire huge warehouse of machines to kick out a product. Now with a 3D printer or a laser cutter, you can create some pretty cool stuff, right from your house. So just to kind of go over this tool list a little bit, starting with 2D design software, we use Adobe Illustrator ourselves, so that's pretty common. It is a little bit pricey if you're using it for professional purposes, but it's part of a suite of tools that's very good. CorelDRAW is also something out there that is really popular. It's a very good tool for 2D design, and it's a little bit less expensive than Illustrator. Another option for just beginning is a program called Inkscape, which is completely free. You can download this, you can start learning it, and you can draw things as much as you want for free. And just in case it doesn't make sense, what I mean by 2D is you're basically drawing everything in a flat environment. So if you can see the screen here, this is Adobe Illustrator, and even though what we are trying to design is a three-dimensional box, in these tools, you have to imagine everything exploded and flat and in 2 dimensions. So that takes a little bit of practice in order to understand how things will fit and draw it in a flat way so that you can reassemble it. You tend to run into a little more like fit issues. You might draw it one way and think it's fine, and then you actually try to put it together and you're like, oh, this joint was in the wrong place, or this slot was in the wrong place. But 2D software is pretty easy in terms of jumping right into it and drawing things. Comes to you 2000 says if you have an iPad, I'd recommend Vectornator for vector editing manipulation. So thanks for that recommendation. I haven't checked out Vectornator yet. Is that one of the online web-based tools, or is that an app that you download? I'll have to check it out. So back to the tools list a little bit. So now I listed a few things here in terms of 3D design that are available. So I use Fusion 360 by Autodesk. It's a really good program, super powerful. I'm only scratching the surface of what it can do, and I'm by no means an expert in Fusion 360, but I love its capabilities, and I'm getting better at it every time I use it. It's a fun program with not a lot of limitations. You can design some pretty fantastic devices through that, and it has built-in simulation and all kinds of cool things. It's free for like students and makers. If you're going to use it professionally, then there's a paid version. Another piece of software that's popular is called Tinkercad. I think it's free for everybody to use. It's web-based, also easy barrier to entry, pretty intuitive and easy to figure out. And another popular one is called SketchUp. It also has a free version, and then it has some, I put free plus for anything that kind of has paid tiers as well. So if you need more features or you want to use it professionally, then there are paid options. And if you're designing for 3D printing, then you also need slicing software. Most printers come with something that's pretty basic. There's some really good free ones out there. Cura and Slicer are good free programs. And I also like Simplify 3D. It's a paid program, but it's also really nice. And then I talked a little bit earlier about 3D printing hardware. I've had a lot of 3D printers over the years. I've probably had 8 or 9 different models now. So I've got a lot of experience with them from different price ranges. And it's pretty crazy to see that the entry-level printers now are doing the great quality that they can do. So, one of the popular printers that's been out for a couple of years now is the Creality Ender 3, and there's a Pro version. And the quality that you can print from that is pretty unbelievable for a sub $300 printer. So if you're definitely looking for something on a budget, then that's a good one to look at. If you really get deeper into this and you're doing a lot of 3D printing and you want something that's maybe a little more sturdy of a build or has a few more features, then I highly recommend taking a look at the Prusa line of printers, specifically the Mark IIIs. It's about the kit version, $750. If you buy it pre-assembled, it's about $1,000. Very similar actually in build to the Ender 3. It just has more features like filament detection sensors, so that it'll know if you run out of filament in the middle of a print, which is actually If you have a printer that can't do that, it pretty much fails your print because it tries to keep going and it can't do anything with no filament. So there are features like that, like being able to recover from a power outage. That's a pretty nice feature too, especially if you're doing prints that can take 15 to 20 hours. You know, the odds are if you're doing that all the time, eventually you're going to run into a power outage, whether it's something you did on your own or whether, you know, it was out of your control, and to have your printer be able to recover from that is pretty cool. Raider 9055 also mentions the Prusa kit comes with gummy bears to get you through the build, which is true. Comes with Haribo gummy bears, which is pretty awesome. And they even built that into the instruction manual, and they tell you as you complete each step of the build to reward yourself with 18 gummy bears. And they step you through that process to make sure you end with the right number of gummy bears left. So that's pretty funny. They make some good stuff. So I wanted to kind of go into the next part of this workshop and talk about 3D design a little bit and go over what that might look like. And I'm going to use Fusion 360 and talk a little bit about this. Now, there are a lot of tutorials on YouTube and on Autodesk's website that go deeper into all of the features of Fusion 360. So I just kind of want to show you a little bit about how the tool works so you kind of get an understanding of what you would do to design something like that. And it's one of those things that once you start getting into it and you're like, how would I do this? Then you kind of jump in and start watching more tutorials to answer that question. Let's see. Confu 2000 also says, I'd say that UV resin printers are overkill for box inserts, but are better suited for things like minis. And I would completely agree. I also have a Creality resin printer in the closet back here. And a resin printer uses it's considered stereolithography, where it uses a UV light to cure a liquid resin. And some of them started out in the early days using a laser on a galvo mirror that would just aim the laser where it needed to go on the build platform. New ones actually use LCD screens that display UV light on the LCD, and it cures a layer at a time, and then the build platform moves up and cures another layer. And they have super high precision detail, which makes them good for miniatures. But their build platforms are typically pretty small, like a lot of times 2.5 by 4 inches. So you're really not going to be able to do much in terms of inserts with a resin printer. So for that, you definitely want to look at something like these filament printers, which are also called FDM printers, fused deposition modeling, I believe, which just means you're extruding out solid filament and melting it. So that's a little bit more background on how those printers work. So let's jump into designing something real quick and talk a little bit about how you would use modeling software to make something that we would print. So let's say we were going to create a tray to hold our lantern tiles, and we wanted to actually make this one fit in the box. So these programs typically work by combining primitives, things like boxes, cylinders, spheres, stuff like that. And you can do a lot by just combining those together. And by combining, I mean you can join them into a single solid piece, or you can use one primitive to subtract itself from another one and cut holes and shapes into things like that. So to start making something like this tile tray, the first thing we'd want to do is decide what our overall dimensions would be. So let me switch back over here to the workspace. And let's imagine we wanted to build a tray that held these tiles like side by side, like this. So the first thing I would do is think about, okay, what's the total size of the tray that I want to build? So, you know, we already know our tiles are about 60. So together, you know, they're a little under, like I said, probably 59, and this measures out to 118. So that's exactly right. You never want to design things that it's going to barely fit in there, because then you have a hard time getting them into tight spaces. Air can get trapped underneath and it won't slide down. So you always want to leave like a little extra space when you're designing. So if this total width is 118, I'd probably want to do something like, keeping in mind we want a wall between these as well. At least I do. You don't have to put a wall in there, but I'm gonna put one. Then you probably want to make this more like 124 millimeters. So then the other dimension, you know, should still be the same thing, about 59. We probably want to do something like 63, just to leave a few millimeters of space in there. So let's go back here. And Fusion 360 is pretty cool in that it's considered a parametric modeling application. That means it uses parameters to create your models. So everywhere that you go to draw something, it's going to ask you for a value. And you can simply type that value into the screen, and that's super cool. So if we want our box to be something like 63 millimeters, and we just type 63 here, and you'll see that it puts a little lock icon next to it. And if I tab to the next dimension, what was it? We wanted 124. So now those two have locked in, and I can simply click it and go from there. Now, if you're thinking ahead, you might be thinking, well, that's your inside dimensions. What about the walls? And that's a good point if you're thinking that. With programs like this, there's always multiple ways to skin a cat. I don't know if you like that analogy. Sorry, cat people. There's multiple ways to do the same thing. So one thing is to think about your wall thickness first and pad your dimensions by that wall thickness. But this application has another way to do that. So I will show you. So let's just not worry about the walls for now. So we're going to make this box 63 by 124, and I'm going to go ahead and click. So now that I've drawn, it's going to ask me to extrude it in the other dimension. And just like when I was building it first, I can just simply type this in. And so for this dimension, we want it to fit in the box, and we know we don't want it to be any higher than, what did I say? I think like 50? Yeah, 50 millimeters. So let's make it 48. And that's going to be kind of the inside dimensions of the box. So one of the things that's specific to this program, and it might be different if you're using Tinkercad or SketchUp, you might have to actually think about your outside dimensions first. But in Fusion 360, there's a feature called Shell. And what Shell does, if you can see from the picture here, it allows you to hollow out one of these primitives, which saves you a lot of time. So if I were to click on the top of the box here and create a shell, the next thing it's going to do is ask me how thick do I want the faces to be. So this brings to another topic. How thick do we want the walls to be? If you're designing something for 3D printing, one of the things that I like to do is think of everything in terms of how wide is your print head. Typically, all 3D printers have nozzles that are about 0.4 of a millimeter. You can buy different size models, but 0.4 is pretty standard. So when I think about printing, in order to make everything go easy, I kind of want stuff to be like increments of 0.4. So I feel like two layers of wall would be too thin and flimsy. So I would probably stick with 3. You could go with more, but obviously you want to go, the thinner possible, the more room you have for other things, and the faster it is to print them. So if we wanted to go a 3-layer thickness wall at 0.4, that would be 1.2 millimeters. So I'm going to use that. And again, these things are kind of like trial and error. I mean, I don't expect to be able to kind of throw out everything you would need to know, but these are things where really it doesn't hurt. If you made your walls 2 millimeters thick, they would just be thicker. But these are the kind of things that as you play with it over time, you start to figure out kind of what works for you and what doesn't. So we're going to do 1.2 millimeter thickness walls. So another option here, by default, it would hollow this out on the inside. But like I told you before, the box we drew was the inside dimensions, and we don't want, if we hollowed it out on the inside, then the inside box we would get would be too tight for the tiles. So in Fusion 360, we can say shell it on the outside, which actually grows everything from the inside out. So that's why it's a little bit easier to just measure the components and then create your shell on the outside from there. So we're going to do that. I hope everybody's still following. This isn't super boring. I know it's kind of techy, but I want to make sure I'm at least like answering questions as I go. So yeah, so we have a box now. Most modeling tools have the ability for you to inspect measurements and just kind of double check yourself. So we could click on something like this edge and this inside edge, and it says it's 63 millimeters. So I've just confirmed that I have enough space to do that. And then I can hit escape and then check the other dimensions as well. And we've got 124. So we did maintain what we wanted, and we built out from there. So Jack says, not what I expected from the session, but it's amazing. I missed how to start the dang shape, but I'm a total noob here. Sorry about that. Yeah, that's a good question too. It's like, I sort of thought early on in this, like, well, what will everybody want to see, and I want to try to cover some other things for sure, and don't want to get too deep into this, but I kind of wanted to touch a little bit on all these different ways that you can organize your games now. And as kind of techie as this is, it's actually pretty accessible with the free software out there and the cheaper 3D printers. So this is pretty cool, I think. So the next thing we want to do is throw a wall in there. So this is another one of those things where you could probably do it about 10 different ways. So what I'm going to do is create a box, and it wants to know like what face you want to draw on. So I want to draw on this back face. And the nice thing about Fusion 360 is it'll tell you where the centers of lines are. And so I'm going to go here, and it'll snap to the bottom. And I'm going to drag out a little bit, but I don't want my wall to be 3 millimeters thick. So I'm going to type over this and change it to 1.2 and then hit enter. Now it's going to ask me to extrude in the other direction. And in this program, you can click on something you want to snap it to. So by clicking that wall, it just snaps all the way over there. Now, I drew from the center to one side. So if you're pretty techie like me, you would already have realized that like one side will be slightly bigger than the other, and I don't really want that. So instead of joining this new shape to this one permanently, I'm going to say that this is going to be a new body, and now I have what's considered two different shapes that are separate inside this app that I can disable. What that lets me do is hit M for my move key, click on this wall, and I want to move it this way minus 0.6, which is half of my wall thickness. So this is just me being a little bit OCD. It's almost like somebody who's into organization would have to be OCD, right? So I want both of my sides to be exactly the same. So now I can just inspect these edges and say, okay, 61.4. Let's see if the other side is the same. 61.4. Cool. So I'm happy with that. So now that wall's there, I don't mind if it's all the same piece. So another tool that you use all the time in here is called Combine, right here, and you pick the objects that you want to combine, and you tell it how you want to. Thank you so much. All right, so I don't know where I was when I dropped out there for a second. Basically, we had combined the wall to the box, and now we're talking about how would we make this a little more accessible. And so, again, this is like a concept. No matter what tools you're using to design a box organizer, you always have to be thinking about how do you get these things out? How do you interface with them with your fingers? And we don't want to just take the tiles and dump them out on the table. So we need to create some kind of access here for getting to them. So tiles at the very, very bottom can be difficult to get to. So I think one of the first things we might want to do is put a few holes in the bottom. And so it's a little bit hard to see when I put it at a super flat angle like that. But there is an option here where we can create a hole anywhere that we want. So I'm going to click on this face. By the way, these flat areas are referred to as faces. And I'm going to click on here, and now my hole window lets me do all kinds of cool things with determining how I want to make a hole. You can make holes with threads in them for screws, and you can make holes that are countersunk for screws. So it's all kinds of cool things. So we're just going to make a straight hole, and we're going to make it, really doesn't matter, as long as you can get your finger in it. We're going to say 30 millimeters in diameter, and click OK, and it's going to cut a hole in the bottom. And let's do the same thing in the other side. And once I do it, I can snap to the center of this square here. So these tools are pretty handy. And it remembers my settings, so I'm just going to hit OK. Now we've got two holes in the bottom of our box. So next thing we want to do is put some, probably some spaces in the side for you to reach in and grab the cards or the tiles out. So there's a few different ways to do this. The easiest way are to create more primitives and use them to cut out the space that we want. So let's just create a box here. And so one of the things we want to do is try to get it centered. I'm probably not going to take a ton of time doing it exactly perfect, but one of the things I'm going to do here is, this is called creating an offset plane. I know that 30 millimeters is about halfway over, and I'm going to do the same thing on this side, and that gives me something to eyeball like the middle of my space. So let's create a new box on this face, and I'm just looking at the number of squares that are on the window here to just kind of eyeball it. So let's say we have a box that's about like right there. Let's see how that looks. I'm pretty happy with that. So we're going to drag the box across through our model, and it's kind of smart enough to default that you probably want to cut. So it defaults to cut. If you didn't want to cut, you could change here to say you wanted to join the shape. But in this case, we do want to cut it. But actually, I want to do this twice. So rather than cutting it now, I'm going to say, let's create a new body out of this. And that way I can take it and copy, create a copy, drag it over here, make sure I have it about in the center. 65, 68, no, that's too far. Something like that. Good enough. You get the point. I don't want to obsess over it too long so we can get to other things. So now created two of them. This is where we can go back and now use that combine feature to cut those out. So modify combine, you pick your target first and then your tool, and then say what you want to do with it. I want to cut it out. And then I'm going to do the same thing. Combine, pick my target, and then the tool, and then say cut. So now we've cut a shape out of there. And that looks pretty good. I mean, it doesn't go all the way down. You have to think about it from an engineering standpoint. If you tried to cut down too deep, then your box would be kind of floppy. So, you know, there's all kinds of cool things you could do. You could put little ridges in here so that the tiles don't fall all the way down. Like, there's all kinds of things. I mean, that's the kind of fun part of this, is that whatever you can imagine, you can experiment with. So it's kind of, you know, it's definitely a lot of trial and error. You might make one of these, and while you're playing games, go, yeah, I don't like that I can't get the very bottom piece out. So maybe you go back and you make something else. And I'm not saying this is the best design for this particular thing. Just really want to go through like kind of concepts of how you would do this. Let's say you wanted to make this a little prettier and you wanted to make these not be hard corners. There's a feature called fillet. It looks like fillet, but I think people call it fillet. Chamfer is another thing that creates square edges right there. You can see in the picture, we don't really want a chamfer. We want to do a fillet. So that's F, and then you pick the corner you want to do. In this program, you can actually multi-select. So I'll pivot around and hold Control and click both of these. And now I can drag and put an angle on there. And we'll do 10 millimeters. And in fact, just to make sure that they're all the same, I will do them all. So bear with me for a second while I maneuver around and click all of these. The other side. Maneuvering in 3D space is always fun and challenging. Okay, now I've selected all of these and put 10 millimeters and click OK, and we just put a nice curve under there. So for this particular activity, I think we'll call this done. It shows you kind of how you can quickly design something. I did a few things earlier that I can show you sort of how it works. I made a box here that I might want to use for storing the favor tokens from the game. So I designed this basically as a square using a cylinder to cut the shape out and another cylinder to cut that shape out. And I went ahead and 3D printed this one so you can kind of see here what this box would look like. Just going to get everything out. So here's an example of what that box would look like after it was 3D printed. And this is with those 1.2 millimeter walls. So it's fairly sturdy. I mean, I'm pressing on this and it's not going to break. And these tokens, I think, were like 25 millimeters. So I just measured those out and it worked pretty well. And so this particular design that we were just working on, in this program, when you're done with the design like this, you would right click on the body and say save as STL. Every program is going to be a little bit different, but the STL file is going to be what gives you the thing that you slice for the printer. And now I'll show you just kind of how that works really quickly. So I'll bring up this tool called Simplify 3D. It's one of the slicers that I use. And if I import that body that I just made, it just kind of drops it into our build platform. In this program is how you tell it how you want to actually print. So there are a lot of parameters for the printing process, like the temperature of the head, and that depends on the filament you're using and all that. So this gets into a whole other discussion, but these tools are fairly easy to use, and most of the time the default parameters are good. And so once you set those up, then in this program we hit prepare to print, and it converts it into the language that the printer is going to use. And in this case, it uses G-code. Let's see. BGHQ Game Lab says, what material did you use? So this was PLA. And for anyone else that's not familiar with 3D printing, there are several materials out there that you can use. PLA is probably the most common. It stands for polylactic acid, I believe. It's a pretty user-friendly material that's made mostly from sustainable and biodegradable materials. I believe some of them are made from corn starches and things like that. The nice thing about it is that it prints at a low temperature, and it's just fairly user-friendly in terms of it doesn't shrink much and that sort of thing. Then he mentions PETG and ABS, which are some other materials that can be stronger and can withstand UV exposure or higher humidities for longer periods of times, but they have other side effects, such as ABS can shrink. So it's not super great for what we're doing here. Imagine if you designed something to be 60 by 60 and you printed it and it actually came out 59 by 59, then you might find like, hey, why is this thing not fitting? So you really don't want to deal with shrinkage. And then PETG is kind of in between the two. It's stronger than PLA, but doesn't have as many of the problems. So that's a little bit about the materials and what you might use. So your slicer here, like I said, turns it into code that the printer can use, which basically a printer is just going to make it one layer at a time. And you can kind of look here at what it's going to do for each layer. We can even say only show me one layer at a time. And you can see like this is what the printer is going to do, one layer. So once this is done, you would copy this to like an SD card, stick it in your printer, and lo and behold, look, I'm already printing this exact same thing. Look, it's almost like Greg had this planned out. So this is on my printer right now, and it should be pretty similar to, let's see, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So yeah, so this should be pretty similar to the thing we just designed. And this is the other thing about 3D printing, like the times are quite long on this kind of stuff. So this box has been going for over an hour and a half, 1 hour and 35 minutes, and it's 64% done. So it's probably going to have at least another 40 minutes or so to go, somewhere around there. So we're looking at like 2 hours and 15 minutes to create this box. So yeah, it's pretty time consuming. I mean, that's a pretty short period of time. It sounds a little bit spoiled for something that we just created and then like produced out of thin air. So overall, that's pretty short. I consider it a long period of time because I tend to look at things from a manufacturing standpoint. So 3D printing is not necessarily a good solution for mass production. It's not something that we do some 3D printing stuff at the Broken Token. We make some tokens and things like that. And we have a print farm of like 20 printers, and that helps us be able to get the bandwidth we need. But typically, it's a little bit harder from a manufacturing standpoint because the time's involved. So you can imagine if this one box is 2.5 hours, if you designed an entire organizer with all the different components that you would need, you're looking at probably 8 to 10 hours of print time to make one organizer. So if you're a business trying to make them and sell them, which a lot of people do on Etsy and other various places, it's a long time. You can't really do a lot of sorry, my printer's making noise. You can't really do a lot of volume at those times. What's happening on my printer, you can't quite see it, but I'm down at the very end of my filament roll, and so I only have about 18 inches of filament left. So we'll see if this doesn't finish, it'll stop. But the nice thing is, like I said earlier, this model is a Prusa printer that has a filament sensor in it. So if it does run out, it'll just pause, and I can stick more filament in there and finish the job. So that's a little bit about 3D printing. Boy, I could go on about this kind of stuff forever. I love talking about this. So I'll show you a few other things. This is another box that I made. This is just a simpler version of the box. If you wanted to do something like store the tiles on their sides, this one was not designed to really fit into the lanterns box, but it was sort of just a little test that I did to check the wall thicknesses and how well it was going to work on the printer and all that. But yeah, I think that worked out pretty nice and came out pretty good. I saw a question earlier. What was it? What layer height did you use for printing? 1.5 or 2 millimeter. So if we're talking layer height, it's actually on 0.2 millimeter. So 2/10 of a millimeter for the actual height value. And with it's a good question too with things like these. Layer height is the amount of space between your layers this way. And if you're not doing something super detailed, then you could probably get away with a higher layer height and print it even faster. So yeah, so that's that. Let me real quick stick it on the printer and go close my blinds because I'm getting a glare on the workspace. I think it makes it a little bit harder to see. Okay. Sorry about that. All right, back to the workspace and less glare. So yeah, so that's 3D printing. So now let's jump in a little bit to another style of organizer, which are the ones I'm most familiar with, and that is the wooden type organizer that we make at the Broken Token. There are other companies out there that make stuff like this. We've been doing this, like I said, since about 2013 now. I personally, this is my favorite style of organizer. I think there's a lot of cool things you can do with it. From a manufacturing standpoint, we can produce them faster. In terms of DIY, it's not the most friendly because you'd have to have a laser cutter. And laser cutters are more expensive than 3D printers. They're not the kind of thing you would typically have at your home. But if you do get one, then congrats, because they're a lot of fun. You can make some cool stuff. So if you're familiar with us, then you probably know what it is that we make. If you're not, then we do a lot of in-game organizers made from birch plywood. There are other materials that we use. We use some composites and some acrylic, but for the most part, we use birch plywood. And I don't know if you can see it from the edge, but it is actually a 3-ply birch wood. And the nice thing about that is plywood is super strong because you get the benefit of the grains of the wood being crossed. So the top and bottom grain run one direction, and the other grain in the middle ply runs the other direction. So it creates a pretty sturdy piece of board. And most composites aren't quite the same. A composite material like MDF is normally something like compressed sawdust into something that becomes like a sheet of wood, but it can still kind of snap. So it can be not as strong. So I want to go over a little bit, if you guys have considered wooden inserts before but haven't jumped into it, I kind of want to show you what assembly of these are like, give you some tips and tricks, and talk a little bit about that. And of course, if you guys have any questions, I'm keeping my eye on chat. So if you have any questions about wooden insert stuff, then let me know. I'll be happy to answer that. So most of our inserts come like this. They come in sheets. You punch them out yourself at home. We say punch out, but the typical process isn't really to punch them. It's more to, or push them. It's more to kind of rock them out. This makes them come out a little bit easier. Let's see. This is a prototype This is a prototype organizer, by the way. So my disclaimer is if we run into any issues, it's because this is still a product in development. So there still may be some changes that we need to make to this. So yeah, so the process here are to remove the pieces typically by just rocking them back and forth. We laser cut everything out except for tiny little nodes on the edges to hold them in place, and they come out sort of just like that. And you can see some pictures and things on here. Our lasers can engrave, and that's what these are. This is actually the laser beam scanning across really quickly and creating images on the wood. One of the other processes that we've just started using in manufacturing is we're now set up to do screen printing directly onto wood, and that's applying ink onto the wood itself. And that's really, really cool because it lets us do more detail and cover larger areas with less time from a manufacturing standpoint. So we can actually do more detailed artwork with screen printing. So you're going to see more stuff coming out with that as a solution. So let's see. I want to jump over real quick to my screen and just pull up our design file. I can show you a little bit about how we design these things, but I don't want to get into it too deep. We start by drawing out the trays, kind of how we see them fitting. Sometimes we have the shape of the box in here where we can piece it together. And then once we have those trays, we have to work out how everything goes into the sheets for the manufacturing process. So that's kind of what that is for. So I'll use this as a bit of a reference guide while I'm building to help remind me how it goes together. So let's see. Game Lab has a question. When did you know it was a good time to turn it into a business? Did you already own your laser? Thank you for that question. I'll punch some stuff out while we talk about that. The first organizer that I created really was just for myself. I really wasn't thinking, hey, a bunch of people would want this and this will potentially become a business. In fact, it kind of seemed quite the opposite. I hadn't really talked to any friends about their need to organize yet, so I felt like I was the only one. I was like, hey, it'd be really cool if this stuff was easier to get out on the table. And so I kind of just made my own organizer. It was after getting it to the table and playing with some friends that they were like, oh, this is super cool. I'd be interested in this. You should make this for this other game. So from there, we kind of just, I decided to post pictures on Board Game Geek and see what people thought about it. And that's sort of how the business was born. So I did not own a laser at that time. I was a member of a local maker community called Maker Place and was going down there to do all my designing and building. And so the early days of the company was me driving downtown 3 or 4 nights a week to use their laser and stand in line and get as much time on it as I can. And then that eventually led to me purchasing one for my small home business, and we just grew from there. So now we actually are running 12 laser cutters and looking at getting 6 more up and running during the next 12 months or so to meet the needs. So it's been definitely a fun journey. So thank you for asking about that. So let's see, I'm also building this without the benefit of instructions. If you guys purchase an organizer kit from us or anybody else, you most definitely are going to get instructions for it. But typically, as is the process for me when I'm building something that is a prototype, we don't have the instructions done for it yet. So I end up muddling through it a little bit more than you probably would need to. But yeah, that's fine. So I'm looking for the back pieces, and those are the middle pieces, and these are the side pieces. So we're just kind of punching out some of the pieces here to do this first tray. And then I'll show you how that goes together. I don't think I have a timeline yet on this lantern's organizer, but hopefully pretty soon. So, all right. Assembly with these, we say that we recommend wood glue. We do know there's a lot of customers out there that, because of the engineering stuff, typically snaps together. A lot of times people say, I don't use wood glue, I just snap it together. And that certainly is your choice. I like gluing everything. I found that even if it snaps together perfectly now, after I've played the game 100 times with my friends, things might start to loosen up a little bit. And so it's just easier for me now to use a little bit of glue as I'm putting it together, and then I don't have to worry about it again. We recommend anything that basically calls itself wood glue. Titebond for us is a favorite, but Elmer's makes a wood glue. Even Gorilla makes a wood glue. So anything like that can work. We just like Titebond. It's proven and it works well, and it's fairly inexpensive. So let's look at this tray and see how this goes together. And this is actually my first time, while I have seen an assembled lanterns organizer, this is my first time putting one together. So, okay, so this particular tray has these pieces that slide through there, and if you'll notice, the slot is cut at a slight angle. This is how we give the tray an angle. So these are just some of the cool things that we can do to make the organizer a little more functional. We don't want the cards to fall out of the front of the tray. And yeah, I believe these are for cards that are added with the expansion. They're not base game cards, I don't think. So I apply a little bit of glue to the recessed area and then just push this down. It's sometimes handy to have a mallet, some kind of soft-ish mallet that's not metal. I mean, if all you have is a metal hammer, it'll work. But some kind of mallet can be helpful if the part is snug or you just can't get enough leverage to push on it. But typically, it's not hard to put those things together. So we put the back of this tray on. Now we take one of these pieces, which is the side, and I'm going to put a little bit of glue here. Make sure I'm in a position where you can see this. Put a little bit of glue here, which that's actually probably overkill. Probably don't need that much. I'm actually trying to decide if I put something on backwards now. We'll see. Maybe Derek or Twan or somebody else that works for us is in chat and correct me if I did it the wrong way. Let me check on the questions too. So let's see. Do you sell laser layout plans? Good question, Azir. No, we don't actually do that right now. You're not the first person to ask. We've definitely had, yeah, I did something wrong. I put this on backwards. I want to pull this off. We definitely have had people ask if we would sell the plans before. It's just not something that we've gotten into at the moment. Maybe one of these days we will reconsider doing that, but for now we don't. So I feel like this is where having the instructions would be helpful, because I feel like I did it the right way, but I feel like I did it the only way, but maybe I didn't. We'll keep going with it that way. Again, sorry if this isn't right, but you'll get the concept. I was looking at it and thinking that the little notch here would be the stand that holds it off the table, but probably not. Probably not. That should be right. Okay, so now we have this tray put together, and you can see how the cards would be held at an angle, and this would just sit on the table like that. I'm going to set that aside, and we don't necessarily have to do the other one. It looks like there's one more that's exactly like that. Let's do something different so we can see what some of the other trays might look like. So for these two, they look like they are the same footprint, but one has a divider inside. And let's see if I can find the parts for that. Probably this. Also, with our instructions, we will have a guide that numbers each of these parts, and the instructions will tell you exactly where to get them. So you won't be hunting like I am to try to figure out what piece comes from where. It'll be much easier with the actual instructions that we give. But I thought it would be cool to show something that's not quite out there yet. So if you guys are familiar with our products, you'll get to see something that's a little bit different. Okay. Just looking to see what other pieces I might need. These two. So being that that has a divider in it, these walls are going to go with it. And then these look like the walls that go to the other one. Let's see. What else could I talk about that I may not have mentioned when it comes to this type of organization? I mean, the nice thing about these pre-made inserts, whether it's ours or anybody else, somebody has spent all the time doing the design for you. And I mean, that it literally takes us weeks to work out the best way that we want to fit everything in the box. It's a lot of time. So when you're buying the organizer, you save that time, you have it ready to go. I think you're getting a pretty professional product with cool art on it. And to me, I think it's just the best way to go. Certainly 3D printing is super fun. If something doesn't exist for a game, or you want to make something that's really custom that you haven't seen before, then that's a good way to do it. But expect to spend a whole lot more time designing and prototyping. You're basically going to be going through all the same steps that we do, with all the trial and error. There's going to be times when you design it and you print it out and it just doesn't work. So you go back to your file, you make some changes, and you print another copy, and then hopefully that one works. And if not, you just rinse and repeat until it's done. And I just described the job of our design department. So it's fun though. I mean, it's definitely one of those things. It needs to be a labor of love for you if you want to do it. And kind of that's how I got started with this too. I built some custom organization boxes that I probably spent 30 to 40 hours on. And I did it because it was fun. And, I wanted to have something cool for my game. The first really custom box I made was for Agricola. And that was one where I spent a lot of time on it. And never could I sell something like that because I couldn't get enough for the time I spent on it. But I have a really cool Agricola box now. And it was worth all the time I spent on it. So definitely if it's a labor of love, then, sorry, I'm punching out some more pieces. Then if it's a labor of love, then it's something worth, jumping into. All right, so I'm just putting the finishing touches on this box.
And Greg, there is an important question, I think, for the Broken Token. Are your designs meant for horizontal storage only, or do you make them suitable for either horizontal or vertical?
Good question. And I'm not sure, you guys can probably read it, but if you didn't read it or you didn't hear that, the question is, do we design organizers for horizontal or vertical storage of your game, one or the other, or for both? So we definitely shoot for designing an organizer that works in either situation. We want you to have the flexibility. Personally, and I think a lot of people agree, games just look good on their edge, right? And they are easier to get off of the shelf when you can just slide it off. If you store your games horizontally and you want the one on the bottom, it's just a little bit more of a pain. So we always do shoot for creating something that allows you to store your games vertically. There are some situations where that may not always be possible. When you look at a game like Gloomhaven that's in a box that weighs like 100 pounds, we asked ourselves early on, how many people are really going to turn this on its edge, and does it matter? So in a case like that, we didn't really opt for that being the number one priority. We still shoot for trying to make that an option, and you can put your Gloomhaven box on the edge as long as the box stays, as long as the lid stays on tight, but I probably wouldn't recommend it. And like I said, it wasn't the number one priority for us for that particular organizer. But good question. Thanks for asking. We do always shoot for that. Were there any other questions that I missed? I don't think so. But yeah, mainly it's about, we always try to design the organizer so that everything stacks to the top of the lid. So as long as your lid is staying on tight, you normally don't have problems with storing them vertically. So I finished this tray, and it's super simple, but nice. The next one is the same footprint, but it has a divider in the center. Oh, that's not going to be the divider. It's this one. And if I had the instructions, it would tell me that I didn't need to put the divider in first, because there's a tab here that allows it to slide in. So I'm just going to start with gluing these together. One of the things that we always try to do is a design principle. We do something that we use the term keying, K-E-Y, like a key. We try to key parts so that they only go in a particular way. And this is an example of that. If you'll notice, this particular side right here, one tab is longer and one tab is shorter. So that means you can't flip it the other way if you wanted to, because it wouldn't go in. This keeps you from accidentally putting it together where this notch would not be usable by that divider. And that's just something that you might not notice, but it goes into a good design, because even though we give people instructions, if you're like me, a lot of times you jump ahead, you're like, I know where this goes, and you just grab it and you put it there. And we don't want someone to put something in the wrong place and have to pop it apart and do all of that. So we try to make pieces keyed every time that we can to make the whole assembly process a little bit easier. I mean, one of our things from the very beginning has been make assembly fun. Like, it should be like Legos. We know that you're buying this thing and you want to make your board game more fun to play, and you want to make it easier to get to the table. But why should this process not be fun at the same time? And of course, I guess that's an opinion. Everybody feels differently about it. We have had people write back and go, yeah, I really don't like building these things. But I would say 9 times out of 10, people tell us like they really love putting them together. So that's what we're shooting for. We want to make this process fun by making it as easy as possible to do and as rewarding as it can be. By having them in kits, it means they're cheaper for us to manufacture, they're cheaper to ship, and you're kind of involved in a part of this process, whether you like it or not. You had to put this thing together, and even though we designed it for you, you can still, when you're done, look back at this thing and go, look at this thing that I built for my board game, and you kind of get a sense of pride in putting it together. And I think that's important too. That actually, hey, that's a pretty good segue into another thing I wanted to talk about, which is what kind of things can you do to customize your inserts? We talked about customizing your organization from the very beginning, but what if you don't want to go through all that trouble and you want to buy kits like these, but you still want to do things to make them your own? So there's a lot of stuff that you can do to really customize these kits. So by the way, I am not going to glue this in there. It's going to snap in just fine. And that way, if for some reason I ever needed to take it out, I could. So this box is done. And one of the nice things about the way we engineer them being pretty snug, you put glue in there and you snap them together, and the glue is not dry yet, but this thing is going to hold together just fine. So as long as you set it aside and let the glue dry, then you don't have to worry about taping it or clamping it or anything like that. So that's pretty cool. I see another question that says, a couple of them, so let me try to get to both. So the first one was, which organizer are you the most proud of, and which organizer are you the most excited to release? Well, boy, that's hard. It's hard to pick one that I'm proud of, because every organizer we do, I feel like we're constantly learning from it and making it a little bit better. So they're always getting better. I go back and I look at organizers that we made in the very beginning, and I kind of shudder. I'm like, oh no, we need to redo that one. Like it could be so much better now. So, I mean, with anything that anybody does artistic, I imagine it feels the same way, because you're always growing, and it's the same with us. So it's hard to pick a favorite, but certainly I feel like the organizer we created for Terraforming Mars, I think it checks all the boxes. I think it not only makes the game easier to get out and easier to play, but it increases the perceived value and fun of the game, because I think we did a lot there to make the game components better by adding acrylic tokens and player trays and other things that just increase the feel of the game while you're playing it. So anytime we can do something like that, I think that's a home run, and those are at the top of my list of favorites. Thanks for asking that. And the last question was, do you have any design software that helps do the tabs notches? And honestly, we don't. I mean, that's kind of the holy grail. It would be nice if somebody had something like that would help. We have experimented with some of our own scripts and things to automate some of those processes. So we are trying to do things to make it get easier, but there's nothing out there that just completely simplifies it for you. Without getting into a lot of detail, there are things you have to take into consideration. Like, for example, when you're laser cutting, they refer to the width of the laser beam as the kerf, K-E-R-F. And that's how much material you're cutting away with the actual beam itself. So when you're designing a box that you want to cut out on the laser, like let's say you're designing this part right here. Actually, let me find, let me just point to this. Let's say you're designing this piece and how it fits into the bottom. You can imagine that if you made this tab 10 millimeters and you made this hole 10 millimeters, what's going to happen is when you cut the tab out, it's going to end up being a little bit shorter than 10 millimeters. And this gap here is actually going to end up being a little bit bigger than 10 millimeters because the laser cuts down the middle of the line. So when you go put this together, it's just going to be super loose and it's going to fall apart. So we adjust for that by offsetting all of these lines in a way that it accounts for the kerf of the laser and makes them fit tight. So that's something that as a customer, you'd never have to know, but it's one of the little tricks behind the scenes that makes, the engineering on these feel good. And that comes from just, trial and error and practice, like I said before. And it's stuff that's just gotten better over time. Things like, putting little rounded corners on these make it easier for them to snap into place. So there's a lot of little things like that we do. I mean, early on when we were creating these sheets and we were putting them into poly bags, the corners would tear. So it was a fairly early on thing that we decided to round the corners. I mean, it's as super simple as that seems, that was something we didn't do in the beginning, So everything just comes from learning about how we can do it better. So let's see. Are you going to make a big box for Terraforming Mars? Yes, actually, we are working on a crate for that right now. It will be an upgrade path so that if you already have the organizer, the majority of the components that you have in that organizer will move over to the crate. So all you'll need to buy is a special upgrade kit we're making that includes the crate and any additional trays that you need for the expansion content. So that will be coming out hopefully very, very soon. And if you haven't yet bit the bullet and bought our Terraforming Mars organizer, there will be an all-in-one thing that's the kit for all of that. So let's see. I recently backed Frosthaven on Kickstarter. How was designing the trays for that game? It has a ton of pieces. Did having done the tray for Gloomhaven speed up the process? So actually for Frosthaven, we're not done with the design yet. We can't really finalize the design until the game publisher finishes the game. So that's always the challenge. The nice thing about working on something like Lanterns, if we start on a game that's already out, then we know what's there, we know what the expansion content is, and we can make a design that works for that. The biggest challenge is not knowing if there will be more content to come. So we try to talk to the publishers and find out if they have plans. Even if they say, yeah, we know we want to make an expansion next year, most of the time they don't know what the details are going to be until, they really get into the design. And it's the same with Frosthaven. Even though they had this fully launched successful Kickstarter, the design of the campaigns aren't done. All the monster and characters aren't designed. And while those should follow a formula, we should know that character cards are a certain size and monster cards are a certain size. Quantities of those things may change. So we can start doing some of the design now, but we can't really finish it until we have what they call a white box copy of the game that is completely done with manufacturing. So it can be a bit of a scramble for us when we get that white box copy and it's like, okay, now you've got to finish this thing up. And on top of that, with Frosthaven, by the way, you have to make 20,000 units of the organizer. So it can definitely be a challenge, but we're up for it, and we love doing that sort of thing. So yeah, I wanted to go over a little bit before we run out of time. It looks like we probably got about 15 minutes left. I will get to the other questions in a second. I started talking a little bit about, okay, let's say you've got a wooden insert and you're cool with that, buying the insert, but you want to do something a little custom and make it yours. A lot of people from a very basic level want to just stain it or paint it. And that way, when it's in the box, it looks super cool. We've seen a lot of people doing that with the Terraforming Mars organizers, because obviously Mars is the red planet. You could do something cool with a red stain, and we've seen some really neat things come out of that. So I wanted to kind of just go over a few little tips and tricks of how you can do some of these customizations. So the key really when it comes to staining an organizer, you want to start when you have full sheets of parts like this. You don't want to punch everything out and then try to customize it, because you can imagine if you try to stain all these little bits and pieces, it's going to take you like a week to do, and nobody wants to do that. So start with your sheets before you punch anything out. And the best way to stain is to really use, you can use a liquid or a gel stain. If you're not really familiar with the staining process, you don't want to dip a paintbrush in it and paint it on. Staining is not like painting your house or painting a miniature like Terry showed us earlier in the stream. With staining, what you want to do is you want to take like a clean rag, like a cotton rag, and you want to dip it in the stain and then you want to rub that stain into the wood. You don't need to glop in a lot because it doesn't take a lot. In fact, the lighter you put the stain on, most of the time, the better it looks, because you're not trying to paint it. You want to see the wood grain. You want the like beautiful grain and the life of the wood to like come out. So the stain should just be an enhancement to that. So you would take a cloth rag bundled up. Don't forget to wear gloves or a mask or something if it smells bad. And then you just lightly dip the rag into the stain, and then you just rub it into the wood across the whole sheet. Just get it over all of the parts. And you're going to want to do that for every sheet in the kit, and then let those dry for maybe like an hour. I mean, the stain won't be fully cured in an hour, but it'll be dry enough to touch, and then you can flip it over and do the other side. Once you've done both sides, then you may want to lean them up against something so they get airflow, and then let that stain like air out for at least overnight, probably like a day, because there's oils and stuff in there that take a little time to dry. Also, after you go over the sheet with the stain, I will normally have a separate rag that is dry, not the one that I'm dipping in the stain, and then I will wipe over the second time with the dry rag. That way, if there's any pooled up bits of stain that I didn't see, it kind of absorbs it back. And you don't want to use your wet rag for doing that because you're just going to keep making a mess. So keep two rags, a wet one, a dry one, clean it off with the dry one, set it aside. And that's basically it. There are a couple different kinds of stains out there that you can use. There are stains that have polyurethanes built in. The polyurethane is what actually seals it. It's like your clear finish coat. I don't normally like using the stains that have those built into it because they're sticky. Those can take days to dry versus hours. The other thing is the polyurethane will seal up the wood, and then you'll no longer be able to use a wood glue to put them together because this won't penetrate through the polyurethane. You'll have to use, if you do that, it's no problem. You'll just have to use a super glue or something that doesn't need to soak into the wood for the glue to hold. So we recommend using like a Minwax penetrating stain or any other stain that's just a wood stain only with no finisher already added. Then you can glue it together. Most of the time with your organizers, you don't really need to put a polyurethane on them or anything. You can spray them if you want, but I think it's kind of a little bit of an unnecessary step. So yeah, that's one way you can customize. Another thing that people like doing sometimes are getting into painting the organizers. You can do a stain coat, and then you can go back and you can paint details on. And we try to do as much cool art as we can, something like the pictures here. And a lot of people like to go through with a miniature brush and like an acrylic after it's been stained and basically ink in these with a color, which can look super cool. So you could do bright colors if you really want it to pop. And you probably want the paint to go pretty heavy at that point because you want it to build up. Another thing that is really cool that you can do, a lot of people now are really doing neat things with those clear resins. I don't know if you've seen those or not, but you can mix up these two-part resins that dry super clear, and then there are all kinds of additives that you can put in those resins for color. So there are glitter additives and tinting additives, and so you mix up your resin, you add your additive, you stir it all up, and then the resin is like self-leveling. So if you pour it into something, it'll level out perfectly flat. So you can do some really cool things. I've experimented a little bit with resins myself. You could mix up a resin with glitter in it, and you could pour it, in there where the rose is, or use like an eyedropper and drop it in there. It's probably not a rose. It's probably like a lotus. But you could like use an eyedropper and drop the resin in there, and it would flatten out in there and be super cool. So there's a lot of cool things you can do with stuff like that. Paint, resin, stain, I mean, you name it, like there's all kinds of neat things that you can do. So we love to see the customizations that you guys come up with. We even have a Facebook group dedicated to just customized boxes and inserts so people can share ideas and ask how other people did things and that sort of thing. So look for that, on our Facebook page if you're interested in that sort of thing. I wanted to check in on questions. So I DIY'd my storage for Power Ranger Heroes of the Grid. I stuck magnets on the bottom of each figure and added sheet metal. Yeah, so that's a really cool technique. That's something that's really, really neat. I love the idea of magnets on figures and connecting them to metal. One of the things that we're always approached with is how can we create organizers that store miniatures in a way that protect the paint jobs and that sort of thing. So the magnet method is super cool. That's definitely a little bit harder for us to equip you with, because we'd have to sell a bunch of magnets and sheets of metal, and it's a little difficult to include in a kit, but it's a really cool thing if you can DIY that yourself. One of the things that we've started doing to solve the miniature problems, there's a couple different methods that we've taken. One is to use acrylic clips that can be a little springy, and design organizers that have trays where the miniatures can kind of clip in by their base. We've done that with Blood Rage and Rising Sun. I think there've been a couple others. One of the other things we've experimented with doing is laser cutting sheets of foam, cutting holes out that are a little bit smaller than the miniature base itself. That allows you to like pop the miniature into the foam, and it will typically hold it in there. And then we just have to find a way for the foam to stay in the tray. Normally that's glue or something like that. So that's a really cool point about the magnets. There's a lot of different ways you can do that. One thing to keep in mind, anytime you want to design an organizer that's going to hold the miniatures like that, where they're all separate and not touching, they're going to take a whole lot more space versus just throwing them in the box. That's always the trade-off. If you want to protect the paint, then you need to separate your miniatures, but you may run out of space. If you're not painting them, or you're doing like a quickie spray job, and you don't care about throwing them in a box, then the storage becomes a little bit easier. For games like Zombicide, where you have 40 of the exact same zombie, if you're not taking the time to paint every one, then maybe having them all in one box is okay, as long as you're using some kind of protectant on your miniatures to protect them before they go in. Let's see. Fun listening to you talking about this stuff while doing something else. Thank you, appreciate that. It's fun talking about it. Let's see. I attempted to use the pluck foam method, but it looked as it was going to cost too much in the end. Yeah, there's pluck foam, which is designed for that, and it can be quite expensive. You can also buy like I forget what it's called. It's like a neoprene foam or a closed cell foam or something. You can get them. They're typically about 3 millimeters thick or so, and you can buy rolls of that at hobby stores. And that's what the kind of stuff we're kind of using to laser cut. It's not the super thick pluck foam, but that can work for you as well for miniatures. What kind of foam is that? Isn't most foam not laser safe? Yeah, so that I'd have to look into it, but this foam is safe to cut. It's very thin. We cut it at a low power, and we cut it very fast, and we have really good ventilation in our shop. So everything there is pretty safe. So, boy, we're getting close to the time, and I've just about pretty much covered everything I want to talk about too. So if you guys have any other questions, hit me up with those, and I will be happy to answer them. We only built a few trays in our lanterns organizer, but I think that's okay. I mainly wanted to show you, kind of the process for how these things go together, in case you haven't built any wooden organizers before. And we can kind of keep working on another tray here and see if any other questions come up. But the process is the same, for all these trays. You're just basically going to go through the instructions and follow those step by step and finish putting them together. I was trying to see what would be another cool one to do. This tray is kind of neat. Let's see if there's any other questions. The products are great, and I have several in my collection. Thank you so much, Janet. I really appreciate that. And there's a lot of good people out there too. I definitely appreciate the props, and I don't want anybody to think this is just really about getting word out there about us. We certainly love for you guys to be a customer. There's a lot of great people out there making similar products. It's really cool to see what people in the industry are doing, and we all learn from one another. And that's been one of the great things about this niche and about this industry, is seeing what other people do. And it's really cool when people come up with great ideas, and so it's fun to see what other companies are doing out there as well. And we obviously want to make the best product we can for you. And so if you ever have any suggestions or questions or feedback about our stuff and what we can do to make it better, then we're all ears. But we definitely appreciate that. Let's see. I'm super excited about this Renegade Con too. I'm like looking forward to the rest of the programs. I had a blast watching Terry earlier. I'm I'm a painter myself, so I'm always looking for more tips and tricks on painting and how I can get better at that. And that was a lot of fun to watch. So let's see, I was looking at this other tray here. There's a couple little parts here. This tray, I'm trying to remember which pieces this holds until I get them all together. I don't remember. Looks like this one's going to work by putting these dividers in here. I'm sort of getting all the parts out on the table. Putting these, nope, those don't go in first. We're gonna go this way. And then this one I'm just gonna do without glue. Mainly just to show you that it can be done. When you're pushing these together, a lot of times you'll hear that kind of click or snap. That's a good thing, that noise right there. That means it's like getting enough friction to hold itself together. So that's good. And you just sort of, when you're building something that's long like this with multiple joints, just start on one side and just kind of go across until you get everything pushed in together. And then on the side, we'll push this in. Yeah, so that's a good point about that clicking noise that I brought up earlier. You know, I've heard people say that they're afraid that that means the wood is going to break, or that gave them the impression that the wood is breaking. That's not what that is. That clicking noise is, it's this tab going into that slot. Sorry that it's not as focused when I go up there, but you'll hear it. When I push these in, next to the microphone, there. So when I push those in, that's the noise you're gonna hear. It's not the wood cracking at all. It's just the friction from these joints going together, and that's a really good thing. It means this piece is not gonna fall out. So this tray I just snapped together in 30 seconds with no glue, and I would be really comfortable leaving this together like this. This is not gonna, it's not gonna come apart. So like I said, it's really kind of up to you if you want to glue it or not. I only did this for speed because we're just getting close to running out of time, and I wanted to build a few more trays, but I still definitely recommend using glue on everything. So yeah, were there any other questions? Let's see. Network error. Oh, I hope you still got me now. Thanks for all the info. Your inserts will be so appealing to my OCD. Yeah, well, welcome to the club, because that's kind of how these inserts were formed, and I think we all have a little bit of that. There's definitely an appreciation to have a well organized game. Something about pulling the game out of the box and seeing every piece where it needs to go, having the cards nicely organized, having the bits all in a box that you can take out and just set on your tray. That's a good feeling to most of us, and that's why these things are popular, and that's why game organization exists. So hopefully you guys will learn something that you can use here, whether it's making your own stuff or maybe working with some of these wooden inserts that will help you out in your future gaming sessions. And we're always here. If you have questions, you can contact us at the Broken Token through our website. Thanks to Renegade for letting me do this workshop. We're having a blast. I'm looking forward to the rest of the weekend. And I think that's about it. If any other questions, you think of after this, just shoot them over to us in email and we'll get to it. But other than that, thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And hope you guys enjoy the rest of the weekend. Have a good one.